the reason we are studying the prophets is because we have an inkling that they may have something to do with Reform Judaism today. And I I just want to sort of remind you where we were. So we studied the text in both the major and the minor prophets, the Book of Kings and Samuel, that seem to indicate that the prophets were more focused on social justice issues than on ritual issues. And that is why our forebears, and I want to be very clear about this, our forebears, our classical reform, founders of Reform Judaism in the 19th century, chose the prophets as their moniker. We are prophetic Judaism. So that, for instance, if you remember the text in Isaiah, where God is saying, you pious hypocrites who are offering your all these great sacrifices, and you think I want the smoke, and you think I want I don't care about any of that. All I care about is to take care of the widow and the stranger and social justice. So our reform forebears, who were also not that interested in ritual as opposed to ethical laws, followed the prophets in sublimating the ritual part of our tradition and elevating the universalistic and moral, ethical part of our tradition. Now, as Rick and I had a conversation off camera, if you will, and I just want to be very clear: Reform Temple Israel is not a classical Reform congregation. Nor are there really any classical Reform congregations left in the Reform movement at this point. We were fairly early out of that mold. Rabbi Fromm of blessed memory actually was fairly classical Reform. Matter of fact, he fought the inclusion of the kippah into our worship. And what was great about Rabbi Fromm is that, because Rabbi Simon of blessed memory, as you know, grew up as an Orthodox, boy chazan, a boy cantor. He was much more traditional, and that could have led to a real problem, and I'm sure it did at times. But when Harold came, Rabbi Fromm was outvoted 2-1 because Harold was also from a conservative family, and so the ritual committee voted to allow kippot in the sanctuary, and also that the rabbis should wear them. And Rabbi Fromm, to his great credit, came on the bima with his kippah. And the sweet aftermath of that story is that I only knew him in his dotage at when he was in the what was the name of the nursing home that the Jewish agency ran in the city of Detroit? It was
Foreman.
Yeah. So I used to visit him there, and every time I saw him, we went fairly often. Every time I saw him, he'd come up in his wheelchair with his big kippah on his head, and he was 90, I think it was 92 years old or something. So, Temple Israel moved pretty quickly beyond the classical Reform. And again, I just want to make very clear so everyone understands, our position now is that a Reform Jew, that's why we call it Reform, we're constantly reforming the tradition, that we are to study the entire tradition and then accept back those traditions that are meaningful in our own lives. But there are some restrictions on that. There are some boundaries. So for instance, we would not allow at Temple Israel the revivification of a ritual that excluded women, just as an example, that would be sexist. We would not allow the revivification of a ritual that was in any way racist or xenophobic against others. So as an example, the original Aleinu, the what we call the adoration, was not this beautiful universalistic prayer, let us adore the ever-living God who made the heaven. No, it was actually a prayer written to exclude the non-Jews, to people who were. So it was very. It said terrible things about non-Jews right there in the text. So if one of the clergy or the ritual committee wanted to revive that version of the Aleinu, the answer would be no. That's not fitting within. That's not a legitimate revivification of a tradition. And I used the example last time of the kosher slaughterhouse that violates the rule of Bal Tashchit, of not hurting a living thing on purpose. So just to give you another example of what would not be tolerated at Temple Israel, like we don't care if you lay tefillin, we don't care if you wear a talit that goes down to your tuchus, we don't care if you pray 3 times. That's really up to everyone, everyone's own. But there's a Orthodox custom called Shakn Kapporis. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's on the high holidays on Yom Kippur. A Orthodox Jew might follow the tradition of taking a live chicken by the legs and flinging it around their head as a way of expiation of their sins. And that, because it does involve cruelty to animals, that would not be something that we would allow. So that's where we are as a movement. But frankly, even though our early Reform forebears saw the prophets as a way to emphasize ethics over ritual, ritual is really not the focus of this particular course. We're really dealing more with the ethical side of the equation, although it's interesting to talk about because there's many repercussions of their decision. So let's get to that. Let's get to the ethical side. Did classical reform separate men and women in prayer? No. So that was one of the big changes that Reform made. They got rid of the mechitza. I will say that and I just also want to mention about how what people think is Orthodox is what they're used to. So as just an example, when I got here, we would only do the Via Hafta. We would only do the Via Hafta in English. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul. And matter of fact, Debbie Friedman, who we just celebrated last night, wrote the melody to the version that we would sing, both thou shalt love the Lord thy God. So never did it in Hebrew. When I got here, we started every once in a while we would chant the Via Hafta using the Torah trope, Via Hafta et Adonai Elohecha, and the ritual committee was very unhappy about it and really gave us a hard time. Too much Hebrew. And when we did it on Yom Kippur one year, I got a really, really nasty letter from a certain member of the congregation who was on the ritual committee about, you're making our services all Hebrew. And this is a true story. So for one of the services this year online, we experimented and did the Thou Shalt Love again in the English, and I got a letter from the same congregant complaining that we hadn't done the Hebrew version of the Via Hafta. So Orthodoxy is basically whatever you happen to be used to. I'm afraid. But in terms of where Reform Judaism is coming from, what we certainly based ourselves in the idea that the prophetic vision is one of tzedek tirdof, social justice, and that's why my father was marching with Martin Luther King before it was the cool thing to do, and why my mother started the Head Start in our town, and why they were activists in immigration and so on and so on and so forth. This is the tradition that they felt called to, the Reform tradition of being a prophetic Jew. And as I also intimated last time, this has been causing us some problems lately. Just today, I got a resignation letter from a member of the congregation based on how, liberal all the rabbis are. Now, that's pretty funny because most of my friends who know me, don't think I'm necessarily liberal. My political position is that if you hew to any particular of these ridiculous parties we're stuck with, you're not thinking very deeply. So if all of your policies are in line with any one of our parties, you're probably not really thinking about the issues very deeply. And so it's pretty hard to pin me down. I'm liberal on some issues and very conservative on others. In any case, it was a letter about resigning. In this particular case, this particular gentleman has given me so much of a hassle over the years that instead of doing the normal thing, which would be to call him and say, let's talk about it, I didn't do this, but I was tempted to send back an email saying "gay isn't to hate," and I think we're going to just let that one go. But his point in general is that politics should have no place on the bima or in the pulpit, and he wants to have it be just a spiritual experience. Not that he comes, by the way, to services, but if he were to come to services, he would want it to be just a spiritual, not a political or a justice experience. And we do struggle with this. And I'm gonna use our president, not Michael Curhan. I'm going to use the president of the Reform movement, Rick Jacobs, who's a friend of mine, as an example. Rick was part of a movement that I helped to lead, which basically said the Reform movement should focus more on the growth of our movement and less on making grand statements about political issues. And one of the things but he's been known for, he's very liberal. One of the things he's been known for is making grand proclamations about political issues. So for instance, and this is an instance where I personally disagree with him, but that's not important. When they moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he put out a statement decrying that decision. Personally, I think he should have taken that opportunity to show that we are on different sides of the aisle and on different issues. And in this case, I think he should have supported it, but he didn't listen to me, and he did what he did. At the same time, and there were a lot of people who were very upset about it. At the same time, one of his campaigns is to create a big tent, an open tent that everyone should feel comfortable in our services. And what he means by that is people of color, people who are trans, people who are gay, people who are lesbians, people who are handicapped. I mean, but I keep saying to him, and we talk all the time about this, are you saying that we should be open to trans, gay, handicapped, people of color, but not to Republicans? like, are they the only people we're not having an open tent for? So I have to be very honest. It's been much more difficult in these last 4 years than it was before that, because of QAnon and the Proud Boys and the anti-Semitism and the fascism and so on. That's been, for a rabbi, you're no rabbi if you don't call out fascism. I mean, there's just no way not to do that. So this has been a more difficult conversation. And yet, this young man who wrote me the letter today, resigning from the temple, although I disagree with just about everything he ever says, I can't imagine anyone I disagree with more. And much of it uninformed and conspiracy theories, but I do empathize or sympathize with someone who says, I'm a Republican or I'm a right winger or whatever it is, and I want to come to services and I want to feel comfortable in the pews. I want to feel like I'm at home. I want to have, now, we should feel comfortable even if we disagree with someone, but nonetheless, I understand what they're saying. And it's really that has caused me to go back and reread the prophets. And so last time we focused on the prophetic texts, which really underscore and support let's say, Rick Jacobs' point of view, that this is all about social justice, and that's what rabbis and synagogues should be doing. However, there are other texts, and there are actually many of them. Actually, I'm giving myself away, but I would say that actually, if you put them on a scale, the prophetic texts that focus on social justice compared to those that focus on the unity of the people of Israel and saving the corpus of the people of Israel, the latter would outweigh the former by tenfold. And my favorite prophet in this respect is the prophet Yecheskel or Ezekiel. One of the very first rock and roll record I ever got was when my parents came home from Israel, and they brought me whatever the hottest group was at the time. Turns out it was a group that included Arik Einstein. Some of you may know he's one of the most famous Israeli songwriters. It was called Kulano Committee, which means the high windows, and they had a song about Yecheskel, about Ezekiel, and it was one of the lines was Yecheskel hu bumba shel navi, which means that Ezekiel was a really hip prophet, he was a heck of a prophet. And the reason for that is because of the text we're not going to read it. It's much too long. It's the text of Ezekiel's chariot. So let me just give you the background. Ezekiel. So wait, does anyone know what year the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians? Anyone got it?
586.
580. Oh, extra points, Noreen. Of course, you always get extra points. 586 BCE, which is, so remember, BCE is 586 years before zero. So we're talking 2,500, 2,600 years ago. The Babylonians destroyed the temple and sent our people into exile in Babylonia. You know the song, by the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept. That's what that song is all about, okay? There's a good Bob Marley version, which is better than the one I just sang, but nonetheless. So Ezekiel is prophesying before 586. So the exile has not yet happened. But remember, he's a prophet, and prophets are supposed to foretell the future. And Ezekiel has this vision, and you can sort of read it. Oh, I have to share it. If you're going to read it, I have to share it. Right? I forgot. So Ezekiel has this vision. I guess it's very long to read out loud, right here. But basically, he has this vision of a chariot, and on the chariot there are wheels, because it's a chariot, and it's got animals, four-faced creatures on each wheel, and chashmal, which actually is the word for electricity, chashmal coursing. It's sort of like, did you ever see Back to the Future? The Back to the Future car, there's chashmal, they're just sort of all over, flashing around it. And he says that whenever the cherubim, the little angels, wanted to go right, the chariot would go right. Whenever they wanted to go up, it would go up. Whenever they wanted to go down, it would go down. The same was true for the winged creatures and for the wheels, as I mentioned. And on the chariot, there's a throne. And sitting on the throne is God, the king. Now, what is the problem? And here you can unmute yourselves if you want. What is the problem? I'm going to stop sharing for a second. What is the problem with Ezekiel, a Hebrew prophet, a Jew, having a vision that includes a chariot with a throne with God/king sitting on the throne. Karen, go ahead.
Okay. Well, isn't it because God isn't supposed to have a human form? So how could he sit?
We're the religion that says you're not supposed to, portray God in a human form. And he's a man sitting on a throne. By the way, if God is human, I guarantee you God is a woman. Okay, I mean, there's no question in my mind. I mean, if you had to have a God, would you want Wendy or Paul? I mean, everybody would choose Wendy. 100. Who do you want to kiss your boo boos and make you feel better? And I mean, come on, it's ridiculous. And I know it's a sexist thing to say, but it's so true. So I don't think God has any gender, but I can guarantee you that God is not a man. If anything, it's a queen, not a king. So here you have this crazy vision of Ezekiel. I'll share the screen again in case anybody was reading it. Ezekiel seeing God as a human being. And it was and the reason that the Kulano Committee said that he was a freaky or a hip prophet is that there were papers written at the time that had proved decisively that he was on hallucinogenic drugs, right? And then there was another one. I remember that when I was in rabbinical school, there was a psychiatrist. He was a Jewish psychiatrist. He might have been a rabbi too. He wrote a paper where he identified clearly the psychotic, what do you call it? The psychosis that Ezekiel must have been suffering from. And because this is so out of Jewish, as we say, it's a big kosher. And by the way, if you take my mysticism course, you'll study the same text, because remember, the mystics were trying to enter into God's presence by finding the broken windows, the koshis, the difficulties, the things that don't make sense in the Bible, and this is one of the big ones. so the mystics, they're called Mirchava mystics or chariot mystics, use this text to try to elevate themselves to God's presence. But this is not the course on mysticism, so we're going to leave that for a moment. But what you should know is that it really was seen to be sui generis and really almost insane in our tradition. However, it turns out that the mystics may have been a way to get to God's presence. The psychiatrist, maybe he was a little crazy. The hippies, maybe he was smoking a little pot, whatever. But the truth is that he wasn't crazy. He wasn't insane. And this wasn't necessarily mysticism. Because what none of those groups knew is Jewish history. And if you understand that this is a text that went before the exile into Babylonia, then he wasn't crazy. If he was crazy like a fox. Why? Because remember, in those days, where did God live? It wasn't, remember, this is not 2020 when we know God is everywhere and God's, in all of us and everything. Back in those days, in biblical days, where did God live? Not there. I mean, yes, there, of course, but there was a home. There was actually a home.
The temple.
Yeah, right. So they call it Beit Mikdash, the home of the holy, right? That's what lived in the temple. And so if the temple was destroyed, what would happen to the Jewish religion or the Israelite religion? End, right? Sof pasuk, no more, end of the story. And Ezekiel understood this better than anyone. And so look what he does. He takes God, who lives in a fixed place. And remember, we did take God with us through the desert in a tabernacle, but that was something you had to carry, right? Ezekiel, knowing this is going to be a very long exile, far distance, puts God on a helicopter. This is a helicopter. And suddenly makes God mobile. So Ezekiel, as crazy as he might have been, saved the Israelite religion. We would not be here today studying this text as Jews if it were not for Ezekiel. We would have gone into exile, and that would have been the end of our story. And so Ezekiel here is not speaking at all about love the stranger, take care of the poor, be good to your grandma, none of that stuff, right? Ezekiel here, his main concern is keeping the Israelite people together and the Israelite religion intact. That's his number one concern. And if you're thinking of it as a rabbi at Temple Israel, if you were studying this text instead of the Isaiah text, you might begin to say, oh, maybe I shouldn't be focusing on divisive issues as much as those that unite us. You understand the point? Right. So unfortunately, both traditions or both ideas are found within the prophetic tradition. The prophets, yes, sometimes cared about social justice, and yes, other times really cared mostly about keeping the people of Israel intact, about Klal Yisrael. So you can't just go to the prophets and say, oh, that's the reason I'm going to be a social justice rabbi. You have to think about it, as I said about my political beliefs. If you're looking at it as like one side or the other, you're not thinking about it deeply enough. The truth is that both sides are right here in the prophets. Let me stop here I think we're sort of at the halfway mark almost. Let me stop here. We have another really cool text to look at, one that you know, but you don't know. Any questions or reflections on how it affects, our modern lives or anything else? Yeah, Merle.
So is this supposed to instill fear in the Jews, or
no, the opposite? Actually,
complacency?
Yeah, the opposite. This was supposed to be. Remember, he knows things that they don't know. So what he's really saying to them is, when those Babylonians come and they take you away, you can still be Jewish. God's going with you.
Okay.
Right. But they don't know they're going to be exiled. Right? This is a prophecy. This is before the fact. But no, he's not trying to scare them. Matter of fact, as you'll see in the next text, quite the opposite. Ezekiel is trying to give them comfort, essentially saying, you know what? Exile, diaspora is not going to be so bad. In the end, everything's going to be fine.
Okay.
So, okay. Any other good question though? Any other questions or comments or? Okay. So let's see. We're exactly at the halfway mark. Good. I think we will have time at the end for some real discussion and questions. So think of that for, I think we'll be able to finish about 20 minutes, hopefully. Let me see if there's anything. Okay. And by the way, remember, what is a prophet? Someone who speaks with God. So at the end of the story of the chariot, it says, that was the appearance and the semblance of the presence of the Lord. When I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face and I heard God speaking. So that's where the prophecy comes in. Okay. So you all know this text very well, because when you were little kids, you would sing, dim bones, dim bones, dim dry bones, dim bones, dim bones, dim dry bones, dim bones, dim bones, dim dry bones, right? And the shin bones connected to the I don't remember the whole song. But that song comes from Ezekiel 37. Okay, that is, and it's a really good, actually pretty accurate reflection of Ezekiel 37. And I think I will read a little bit. Let's see. The hand of the Lord came upon me. He took me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me down in the valley. It was full of bones. He led me all around them. There were very many of them spread over the valley, and they were very dry. He said to me, O mortal, can these bones live again? I replied, O Lord God, only you know. And he said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. That's from the song, by the way. Thus said the Lord God, or vice versa. to these bones. I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live again. I will lay sinews, muscles upon you, and cover you with flesh, and form skin over you. And I will put breath into you, and you shall live again. And you shall know that I am the Lord. I prophesied as I had been commanded, and while I was prophesying, suddenly there was a sound of rattling, and the bones came together, bone to matching bone. The shin bone to the whatever it is. Al, your bones wouldn't fit together, but everybody else's bones would have fit together, just fine. And the bones came together. I looked, and there were sinews on them, and the flesh had grown, and skin had formed, etc. And there was breath. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath, O prophesy, O mortal. Say to the breath, thus said the Lord God, come, breathe to the four winds, live again. I prophesied as he had commanded me. The breath entered them, and they came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast multitude. And he said to me, O mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up. Our hope is gone. We are doomed. Okay, so let's stop there. So what is the analogy? I read a little bit too far. So who are the bones? What do the bones represent? Anybody? It's right there in the text.
The house of Israel.
A house of Israel. That we look like we've been scattered like the bones, and we've been dried up and desiccated. But you know what's going to happen? We're going to live again. We're going to come back to life. And indeed, it turns out to be true, because under Cyrus, the Israelites, the Hebrews, are indeed allowed to come back to Israel once again. To rebuild the second temple. And of course, that is destroyed in 70 CE by the Babylonians, 586, who did it in the 70? The Romans in 70 CE. And then under Ben Gurion and the rest of our heroes, the bones come back to life again in 1947, 1948. Well, let me keep going a little bit. They say, our bones are dried up, our hope is gone, we are doomed. Prophesy therefore and say to them, thus said the Lord God, I am going to open your graves and lift you out of the graves, O my people, and bring you to the land of Israel. You shall know, O my people, that I am the Lord, and I have opened your graves and lifted you out of your graves. I will put my breath into you, and you shall live again, and I will set you upon your own soil. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and have acted, declares the Lord. So again, here, the major issue of Ezekiel's career and life is to prophesy in such a way that's going to unify and bring back and revivify and reunite the Jewish people in their land of Israel. This is a Zionistic prophecy. It's a Klal Yisrael prophecy. Nothing at all to do with being good to the stranger or the widow or the orphan or the poor or any of that kind of stuff. It's all about the sanctity of the unity of the people of Israel.
It also says on your own soil.
Yeah, well, I said it's a Zionistic.
Right. So that's pretty significant.
Yeah, it's a major. I mean, Ezekiel, you can see why Ezekiel is my favorite of the prophets. I mean, but it does belie the idea that the prophets were just all about social justice at all costs. I mean, clearly one of their main concerns was keeping us together as a people. And to do that, you have to be a little more subtle, I think, you might want to be a little more subtle in terms of divisive issues. So it's the answer to the question is the prophets don't really help us at all, because you could use them to argue one way and you can use them to argue the other way, which is very Jewish, of course, in general. I just like it because I do think that as we get older, we begin to become more tolerant of paradox. And the prophets are a paradox. It's not just a unified message. It's both. We both have to be social justice warriors, and we have to be vigilant about keeping the people of Israel together. And that's why I never should have become a rabbi in the first place, because it's an impossible job.
Rabbi, is this an explanation of our
image of what the Messiah will do?
Yeah, really, really good question. And yes, there is certainly messianic tones to this, because remember, well, I don't know that whether Elijah was foreseeing the return under Cyrus politically, or whether if you were Orthodox Jew, you would argue, no, he was looking at the messianic return to. Remember, there are ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionistic Jews. Why are they anti-Zionist? Because they don't believe people should be doing this. They believe it's supposed to come when the Messiah comes, and it's a God-created return. In Ezekiel's case, he didn't have to wait to the Messiah to have the Jews return to Israel. It happened politically. And then, of course, in the 20th century, it happened again politically. But there are ultra-Orthodox Jews that are, as a matter of fact, this is a little bit of an aside, but you may have been, I don't know, some of you may have been on the call today with Josh Weinberg, Rabbi Josh Weinberg. Was anyone? I think I saw some of you there. Yeah, so this is an aside, but I think it's an important one. So Rabbi Weinberg is the head of the of ARTSA, and which is the Reform Zionist movement. And I was involved. Rabbi Hornston and I were delegates to the World Zionist Organization Congress this year, and a really terrible thing happened. There was a man who started an organization. So just a little bit of background. In order to vote in the World Zionist Congress elections, you must sign an affidavit which says that you are a Zionist. In other words, no anti-Zionists need apply. Okay, it is an organization for Zionists. And this man, I forget the name of the organization, he created an organization and he started signing up Charedim, which are the black hats, anti-Zionist Charedim, in telling them that if they did this, their movement would get more money. And I forget how many tens of thousands he signed up. And so the Reform movement, although we had more votes than anyone else and more votes than we'd ever had before, lost its position of power within the World Zionist Organization to this Haredim anti-Zionist organization because of their acts, which was, a heinous thing to do. He literally told them, there was even an article where he wrote that they should lie on the affidavit, which is a funny thing for a rabbi to tell people to do. But that's what happened. And so here we are in a situation where this year, for the very first time ever, the World Zionist Congress included anti-Zionists. And it's never happened before. But the reason they're anti-Zionist, the reason I'm mentioning this, the reason they're anti-Zionist is because they don't believe that Ben Gurion should have done what he did, that this was God's prerogative to bring us back, and it can only happen when the Messiah comes. So to your question, we have no idea whether Ezekiel was talking about the political revivification or the mystical, the messianic one. I personally believe with you that he was probably focusing on the messianic one, but there's no way to know. Frankly, I don't think he would have cared. I think he would have taken whichever one came first, which is what happened. Good question. Anything else about Ezekiel that you want to talk about?
How was he received by the people?
Prophets in generally were decried and rejected, as they are, many times in our world as well. A funny story about that. I think I could tell it now. I think the statute of limitations is up. So some of you may remember a young man that grew up at Temple Israel, one of the finest, smartest young men I had ever had the pleasure to teach. His name was Fred Dobb. The Dobbs moved to years ago, moved to Baltimore, but they were very active in the congregation, D-O-B-B, Fred Dobb. And Fred was a prophet. I mean, he, as a teenager, he had created social justice organizations that were doing, yeoman's work in terms of dealing with poverty and racism. And I mean, this was a young man who was destined for stardom in the reform world. He was one of the most effective social justice activists I had ever met, and he was only 18 years old. So he goes to the University of Michigan, a very bright boy, gets all A's, and he applies to the Hebrew Union College. And I wrote him a recommendation like you've never seen a recommendation written before. And basically said, this is the prophet Isaiah. Like you can't, there's no way, if you reject this boy, you're rejecting the prophet Isaiah. He goes to his, to the interview, and first of all, I will say, he didn't go dressed in a suit. He purposely sort of ujied them and went dressed in blue jeans and a work shirt or something. But more than that, and this is what really got them, is he brought his own mug. Now, why would that be such an affront? So in Cincinnati, there were rumors, all of us knew the rumors, that when you walked into the interview, that part of their way of testing you was they would offer you something to drink. And somehow, how you answered that question had an impact on whether you would be accepted into the school or not. There was some sort of psychological thing they were trying to do. And this was a very well-known Bubba Misa, back in the day. So Fred knew they were going to offer him something to drink. That was well established. And he doesn't use paper disposable cups. So when they bring him into the room, Mr. Dobb, nice to meet you. This is Professor such and such and Professor such and such. And they say, would you like us to get you something to drink? And he says, yes. And I bought my own coffee mug. Unfortunately, they pointed over to where the coffee was, and they had 20 ceramic coffee mugs waiting there for him. And they were offended by the fact that this young man was trying to put it in their face, if you will, and he was rejected. So literally the prophet Isaiah was rejected from the Hebrew Union College. All A's, University of Michigan, involved in every aspect of Jewish life, rejected. And you can imagine the letter that I wrote after that incident. And the really interesting sort of, for me, sad part of the story is he immediately applied to the Reconstructionist College in Philadelphia. They took him on the spot, and he became the most successful Reconstructionist rabbi in America. He now leads the largest Reconstructionist congregation. I think it's in, it's either Baltimore, I think it's near Washington, D.C. I don't know exactly what, there's lots of states that come together right there. I'm not sure what state it's in, I think, but it's right near DC, the most successful Reconstructionist rabbi in the country. And he was one of my boys. And because he was too prophetic, he didn't get into the school. And that answers your question. If the Reform movement, the prophetic of Judaism, can't accept a kid who's a little bit too prophetic, imagine how they dealt with someone like Ezekiel back in his own day. But good question. Anything else before we wrap up? Anything at all? Okay. So I do want to bring us into, this whole class was meant to bring us home to Temple Israel again, because these are the things that I struggle with and my colleagues struggle with, and we do it all the time. So let me just tell you about a few real life situations that have come up where this exact debate has been brought into play. So here's one of them. Temple Israel is, I say this all the time, we are not a statement issuing organization. And what I mean by that is, if we were to be like the Reform movement or like the AJC or like any of these other, we would be doing nothing but putting out statements about every situation in the world. I mean, every time there was a forest fire in California, or an incident, in Nigeria, or I mean, you couldn't, and although, and we don't all agree on everything, so it would take 30 hours of debate to wordsmith the document, then put it out and piss off half our members at the same time. The way we do politics is we have programming, like we have lots of programming, like our food pantry, just as an example. And we give sermons, and there's something called freedom of the pulpit, and rabbis basically can say anything they darn well please on the pulpit, but that doesn't mean that they can use the temple's other facilities in any way they want. Actually, before I go to the modern story, let me go back 30 years. So one of my favorite stories about this is not actually least favorite stories, is that when I first got here, I was approached by 2 lesbian women asking me to do their marriage. I had a friend, Mark Blumenthal, who was rabbi. He was in my class. He was rabbi at Temple Bethel at the time, who was gay. I called him my gay guru whenever there was a gay issue. It wasn't an issue I had really dealt with very much in my life. When I ever had a question, I went to him. So we went out for lunch, and I said, Mark, I've got these 2 women. They want me to do a marriage. What should I do? And he said, Paul, I've actually decided I don't do I don't do gay Kiddushin weddings. He had a reason. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I said, okay. So I called him back and said, no, I don't do gay weddings because my gay guru told me I don't do gay weddings. So they said, Rabbi, we just want to come talk to you. I said, of course. So they came into my office. And I must tell you, these were the 2 most Jewish people I'd ever met in my life. I mean, they volunteered at every activity. They were, one of them was a Jew by choice in the conservative movement who taught religious school. And I mean, on and on and on and on. They were living intensely Jewish lives. And they said to me, Rabbi, we're not trying to make a political statement, but we're going to have children, and we just want our religion to bless our union. So I said, you're making really good points. Let me think about it. It just so happens, sometimes God does work in mysterious ways. It just so happens I was preparing materials for a class on the Ramah, Moses Israelis, Rabbi Moses Israelis. Now, if you don't know who he was, he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, or at least the Ashkenazic version of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is the book that Orthodox Jews go to find out what they should do. It is the handbook of Orthodox Judaism. Anything, if you want to decide whether a chicken is kosher, you go to the Shulchan Aruch, or whether, how high a mechitza should be, you go to the Shulchan Aruch. That is the handbook of Orthodox Judaism. And I'm reading about the Ramah, and there's a story about a young couple who were engaged by their parents. And by the way, when you were engaged, you were engaged a year before. The wedding was a year later, but Erosin was the year before. So you were already sort of married while you were engaged, to the point where you couldn't have sex, but you couldn't live together. But if you wanted to break up, you had to get a get. Got it? So these people were in Nisuin. They were in Erosin. They were engaged, and they were very young, underage, and their parents had a financial falling out during this year, and decided to break them up. And they would get a get, and they would never. If you got a get, by the way, you can't remarry. There was no second. You couldn't marry your ex-spouse. They were in love. So they literally run away. The text reads like a Western movie where they're running away on their horses, and the bad guys are in the stagecoach, running after them and trying to stop them. And it turns out they get to Israeli's study just as Shabbos falls, and the parents are right behind them. And they tell them the story, and they beg him to marry them. And Israeli's amazingly calls in his assistant as a witness, 2 witnesses, and marries them on the spot. And of course, when Shabbos is over, people are furious. His colleagues are about to, he's the great rabbi of the generation, but they're about to defrock him. And he writes an eloquent defense of himself, eloquent in that it is 4 words. he writes, I did this wedding on Shabbos, even though it's forbidden. He said, Ki gadol kavod habriot, because the dignity of the individual is so great. In other words, this goes back to what we started with, that the halacha is important, but not as important as the dignity of these two young people whose lives were about to be ruined by their parents. And so he violated Shabbos in order to do this mitzvah. And I called him back in my office. I said, you know what? I just happened to be reading this text, and this is a ki gadol kavod habriot moment, and I don't really care what the government says, and I don't really care what my movement says, and I don't really care what Mark Blumenthal says. I'm doing your wedding. So I did the first gay Jewish wedding in Michigan, and nothing really happened until a year later when the Jewish News did an article on it, and suddenly there was a huge brouhaha. I mean, to the point where I was about to lose my job. Wendy was great. She was like, hey, whither thou goest, I will go. It was a really tough time for me. I talk about it sometimes in my prayer course, but again, this is not about prayer. It's about prophecy. And, it just was terrible. I know it sounds crazy now because today people wouldn't even bat their eyes about it. But 34 years ago, I had one person in power in the congregation tell me openly that he was homophobic. He'd start his conversation saying, I'm a homophobe, so blah, blah, like imagine, you can't even imagine anyone doing that in a Reformed congregation doing that now. But remember, this is 34 years ago. And the reason I bring this up is that the issue then became, they knew because of freedom of the pulpit, they couldn't stop me from doing gay weddings out of the building. But what they could do is stop me from doing gay weddings on the bima, right? Using the facility, because that they own, right? So it's a pretty sad story. But it does talk about freedom of the pulpit. So in our, actually, let me tell you the good ending. The good ending is that we decided to create a committee. It was called the Kulano Committee. And not only did the committee side with me that I could do gay weddings on the bima, but they also decided they went way beyond that. We were the first, as a result, we were the first congregation in the country to get rid of husband and wife on our intake forms. So 30 years ago, we were doing spouse and spouse. Most places just started doing that like last year, right? And this is 30 years ago. Our forms were changed spouse. We started a AIDS, a really effective AIDS organization. We had all sorts of programming for gay and lesbian couples. We changed a lot of our terminology. I mean, this Kulano Committee went from a congregation that was upset that their rabbi had done a gay wedding to the most gay-friendly congregation in the entire city, really in the country, except for the two gay congregations at the time. So, so it was really a marvelous story. And one of the reasons I love Temple Israel, frankly, I wouldn't be here today if the story hadn't turned out that way. But it did. And the point is that, we have freedom of the pulpit. We could say what we want on the bima, but if we're going to send out a statement, this gets us back to the statements. Well, now we're using Temple's email list. We're using Temple's, paper, their stamps, that's a whole different level of needing to consult. And so just recently, we put out a statement about the attack on Congress. And we don't do it often. We don't do things like this often. As I said, we only do it in sui generis, once in a lifetime type of moments. And in this case, I wrote it, but I sent it to the president first. It wasn't, unlike, I don't send my sermons to the president, to if he's unhappy about it, he can tell me at the Oneg Shabbat. But in this case, we were using Temple's website and their what do you call webpage. So frankly, he had some problems with it, and we had to. And so the statement that I sent out, we sent out as a clergy, was shorter, I think even better than the one we were going to send out, and not quite as pointed at any individual. So that had to be more of a discussion as opposed to a sermon, which is just the rabbi can say whatever he wants to say or she wants to say. The other example of this that was recent, and then I'm going to have to stop. I have to get on another Zoom. God help me. Is that when George Floyd was murdered, we put out a statement. It was actually a video statement. I don't know if you've seen it. It's gotten like 15,000 hits. It's actually pretty interesting. We put out a video statement decrying, the situation, and a few months later, a committee formed, and they're doing wonderful work, by the way. If you haven't seen the anti-racism stuff that they put out every month, it's really spectacular. You should look at their what to read, what to look at. Anyway, but they wanted to put out a statement, and we said no. And the reason we said no is that we had just put out a statement, an anti-racist statement, a month before, and if we're going to do two about that, then we are going to have to do a statement about every single thing. So, and there were people that were upset at us that because we didn't put out another statement, that this is so important, we should have put out two. So we're walking this line constantly between social justice and the prophetic vision of having justice be our number one concern, and the concern of Ezekiel, which is, but wait a minute, we also have to keep this congregation together and make it a place that's safe and feels open to all. That's where we are, and that's why I will end by saying Reform Judaism is prophetic Judaism, because it tries to do both of those things at the very same time, as impossible as that is. So with that, I am going to leave you. I hope you will, if you're interested in reading these texts in more detail, by all means, write to my assistant, Donna, and she will send them to you. And have a great and prophetic week. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank
Do
you.
more like this. Do more like this.
We will be. Ariana, you hear it? Go for it.
We definitely need part 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good
Take care,
night.
guys.
Good night.
Right.